Hi, everybody. Welcome to class this week. This week, we're going to be talking about universal design for learning. That's going to be the primary focus of our content this week. And then we're going to touch a little bit on differentiation. But again, the focus really is universal design for learning. And before we get started, I just want to touch base with you as a teacher because I want to really stress how important what you've learned up to this point in our class and then what you're going to be learning this week, how really important it is. So, stimulus prompting, response prompting, and universal design for learning are major evidence-based practices for our students. Not only that, they make your planning so much easier. They make your instruction more efficient and more effective. And most importantly, they result in more positive, better student outcomes. So as you are watching the video this week, I want you to pay close attention because not only am I going to be looking for UDL in your future lessons and the work you do in this class, but it will heavily impact the quality of your instruction and again your student outcomes. So make sure that you're paying attention, and if there's something you don't understand, re-watch the video or reach out to me and ask questions. I'm always happy to provide you with any support that I'm able to. Before we get into the content, I want to touch base with you about just some grades. One of them is with your participation assignment. So at this point, I have, graded several of your participation assignments, and you know what the expectation is. I've given you feedback. So from here on out, I will still review your participation assignments and grade them. However, I will not be giving feedback on those any longer. So basically, if you complete all of the questions, then you will receive full credit. So make sure every time I say stop the video and do this, that you do it, because again, that is what I'm looking for, is that you complete all of the questions. Now, I do want to talk to you about the discussion guides because those are very different than your participation assignments. And so you have to address them differently. With your participation assignment, you're trying to see what do you remember. You're just now, seeing the content for the first time. But by the time you're doing your discussion guides, you should have already read all of your readings for the week, your articles or your chapter. You have watched videos, you've received all of the content. So I expect those responses to be more thorough. Those are not just quick writes, although you can write them as bullet points or, in paragraph form. But I am looking for thorough responses. And one of the ways I'd like you to think about it is that your discussion guides are my progress monitoring. That is exactly what they are. I am monitoring your progress and your understanding. And so I'm using those as formative assessments. And even though they're not worth, a large number of points, you need to be thorough with those because at this point, students are losing points because they're just given like a quick little response. I'm looking for your understanding related to whatever that content is. I also want to remind you, because this can be a big motivator to make sure you're given thorough responses, is that if you have an A in the class by the end of the semester, you get to exempt the final. You don't have to take it. So while a point here or there may not seem like a big deal, if exempting the final is something you want, it really does make a difference. Also, a reminder that on your projects, I'm happy to give you feedback if you get them to me in enough advance. So what you'll need to do is there is an assignment on Canvas that is called Feedback Submissions for Feedback, where you submit your submissions for feedback. And so you just upload your project there. I need to have it 10 days usually in advance, although you could reach out to see if I have time to review it if it's after that amount of time. But you will upload it then, and then I ask that you email me because I don't check Canvas grades every day, and so I want to make sure that I know it's there as quickly as possible. All right, just some important stuff. In today's video, we're going to do an activity where you're going to do a brainstorm of UDL strategies. I just want to make sure that you know that that needs to be on a specific Google Doc, and that link is on Canvas, and I'll show it to you in just a few minutes. So today you're going to complete one side of that activity. And then later on in class, on Monday, you are going to come back and with a partner, you are going to revise that. So make sure that you keep that document and that when you submit it, you submit them both together. And again, you'll see what that looks like later on in our videos. Today, we're going to be talking about universal design for learning, and universal design for learning has three core principles that we'll talk about in depth. One of them is multiple means of engagement. How can students engage in learning? Another one is multiple means of representation. How can you represent in different ways the content, the skills, the information that you want your students to learn? And then the third core principle is multiple means of action and expression. So how can your students actively engage in their learning and express their knowledge? And then it also has 9 guidelines, which we'll go into all of this more in depth. Here are your learning objectives if you'd like to read over them. So what we're going to do now is I'm going to ask you 2 questions and then I want you to stop the video, respond, and then come back because this is for your participation assignment. This is a quick write, okay? So we're going to start with when you think of good teaching, and you can think of a teacher you've had in the past, what comes to mind? Or it could be just something you've learned. So again, when you think of good teaching, what comes to mind? And then your second question is, what do you consider good teaching? So this will go on your participation assignment. Go ahead and stop the video and then come back when you're finished. All right, now that you've been thinking about what good teaching is, I'm going to give you just a couple of examples. And again, these are just a few examples. There are many other things that good teaching looks like. And so you might see some of the things you wrote in reflected in this, or you might have something completely different. One example of good teaching is that teachers acknowledge that every student is unique. Students with disabilities, students without disabilities, every student is unique. Not only that, teachers use flexible materials, flexible methods, and flexible assessments when they're engaged in good teaching. If you start thinking, go back and you think about your high leverage practices using multiple assessments, right? Not just one source, but multiple sources of assessment. Another example of good teaching is that teachers plan so they meet the needs of all children, not just some. And this is going to be a big part of what we talk about today is how do we meet the needs of all children, not just some? Well, as teachers, one of the ways that we do that is we engage in some kind of action, right? And that action is our planning, it's our teaching, it's our delivery of instruction, it's our assessment. But what's really important is that we engage in all of those things with intentionality. So you are intentionally planning your instruction, your content, your assessment, your activities so that all children are learning and that all children's needs are met, not just some of them. Again, when we teach, we plan, we teach, we assess with intention. But when we are planning with intention, we also have to be aware that there are barriers to learning for our students. And we're going to be speaking directly to students with complex support needs. Some of those barriers are language and symbol systems. So if you think about students who use AAC to communicate, or students who are currently not using AAC but don't have or aren't using vocal language. If you think about students who aren't yet able to read or access reading through letters, words, sentences, and paragraphs, or students who are using picture supported text. We have to think about what those barriers are. We have to look at things like environmental barriers. Are our students able to access the sink in order to wash their hands? For a student who uses a wheelchair for mobility, are they able to access all parts of the school or the classroom? We're looking at instructional barriers. We would love our students to be in inclusive settings. What are the instructional barriers that they might encounter in a general ed setting? Or what kind of instructional barriers are they facing in our own classroom? We want to make sure that we're taking into account assessment barriers and then systematic barriers to access. But when we're thinking about barriers and how do we remove those barriers, there is one thing that is extremely important. It's you. It's you. Because you have to intentionally, this is where that intentionality comes in, you have to intentionally plan for the removal of those barriers. And today, when we think about UDL or we learn about UDL, we're going to learn about a variety of ways that we can assist our students in overcoming barriers, but we can remove them so they just don't even encounter them at all. So what we're going to do now is we're going to do a quick write, and this is 3 minutes. So I want you to stop. This is a 3 minute one, so time yourself on it. This is not one I want you just to roll through. So there's going to be a handout. I'll show you what that looks like in just a minute, and it is found on Canvas. And this is what I want you to do is I want you to identify what Alex's barriers to learning are. So first is identifying the barriers. And then I want you to come up with a way to address and hopefully to remove each of the barriers that you identify, and you're limiting yourself to 3 minutes on this. But I'm putting in 3 minutes instead of just one because I want you to think about it and see how many you can find. And so this is our information on Alex. Alex is learning to compare the weight of substances. He has limited hand use. He uses a wheelchair for mobility and communicates using a head switch and an assistive technology device that presents 8 choices per page. He has a concrete understanding of concepts, needs content presented in small segments, and seems to prefer tactile objects for representations. As his teacher, you will need to plan how to teach the content in a way that engages Alex, promotes his understanding of what it means to compare and how to make a comparison, and allows him to respond to questions and within activities. So he's responding to questions and within any activities you plan. So take 3 minutes to write down your ideas for how you would remove barriers to teach and assess this content with Alex. So first I want you to identify the barrier, and then you're going to address a way to remove each barrier. And this is the form that is on Canvas. So what you're going to do is you're going to use these first 2 blocks, because after you learn about UDL, you're going to come back and revisit it. So here's where you're going to list your barriers. And this is where you're going to list your ways to remove those barriers, your strategies. And then this will be submitted to Canvas by midnight on Monday. All right, so let's jump into universal design. Universal design originated with architecture and really looking at like how do people access buildings, because we need to make sure all buildings are accessible to everyone, whether you're going to a school, to a post office, to the Social Security Department, whether you're going to the grocery store or a gym, everyone needs to be able to access it. So within architecture, what they did was they looked at a couple of different areas. They looked at tolerance for error. So what is the tolerance for error if you were, say, walking or riding a bike down this sidewalk? They looked at perceptible information. So can someone read it? So if this is one of the reasons that we have things like Braille on elevators or by bathrooms or by conference rooms. We need to make sure that individuals who have low physical strength can have access to different buildings or things related to architecture. We want to make sure there's equitable use. That things are simple and intuitive. So again, here's an example of an elevator, and we wouldn't have like 1, 6, 21, 14. We want to make sure it's simple and intuitive for people to access. We need to make sure of things like size and space. Can people of different ability levels, different heights, reach things or access things in different areas? And then can we have some flexibility in use? And so here's an example with a desk and somebody who's left-handed or right-handed use it. So that's where universal design for learning came from. So what I want you to do now is to stop the video and think about, have you ever heard of universal design for learning? So write what you know about universal design for learning. And then if you're like, I don't know anything, Ty, write down what you think it might be, okay? And then come back and join us. All right. So, what is UDL? Well, let's start by saying it was developed by CAST, which is the Center for Applied Science Technology, through a grant from the Department of Education. And so, what it is an educational framework that is really focused on and designed around making learning accessible. And it's making it accessible by accommodating all students, again, regardless of disability. So, again, it's an educational framework that is designed to make learning accessible for everyone. And it really is focused on a core principle that says that one size does not fit all. I can tell you when I was in school, and I'm sure you've all experienced this as well, people just did the same thing. And it doesn't matter who the student was, a teacher taught one way, and that was the only way that they ever taught. And what we've realized is one size does not fit all. We need to make sure that we plan and we instruct and we make learning accessible to everyone. And so, again, the ultimate goal is that we design our instruction so that it is flexible and it is inclusive and that it supports all learners, all learners. So, UDL is not just for students with disabilities, it is for all students. So, why are we even talking about UDL? Like, why is this even important? Well, it's because it creates classrooms and instruction where every student can succeed. Isn't that really what we want? We want every student to be successful. Whether they're in our class, whether they're in a general education class, it doesn't matter. Not only that, that we want to make sure that we are ensuring that all students have equal access to quality learning. It doesn't matter what their ability level is, what their age is, what grade they're in, what culture they're in, what language they use. So again, this is where we're looking at students when we think about using culturally responsive practices. This is a way that we can look at students who are from different cultural and linguistic backgrounds and make sure that we are meeting their needs. Not only that, it removes barriers to learning and access while also providing flexibility. And you're going to see that more clearly as we move in and talk about those core principles. And so why? Why UDL again? Well, because in this day and age, we have a great deal of diversity in our classrooms. You know, I can tell you that I used to teach in Charlotte Mecklenburg schools in Charlotte, North Carolina, and I within my classroom could have students from, if I had a class of 10 students, it would not be unusual for me to have 4 to 6 students who are from a variety of different cultures and backgrounds. But not only that, we have students who come from very different life experiences. So we want to make sure, again, that we're inclusive of everyone. Not only that, there are common barriers that students face, common barriers related to accessibility, common barriers related to students' engagement, and then how do students express their knowledge. And then finally, again, we just want to really stress that one size does not fit all in education. And because we know and accept that to be truth, then we make sure that we plan accordingly. And one way to do that is through UDL. All right, do a quick check-in on yourself and see how you feel about that content so far. You should not have a clear understanding of UDL at this point. Again, this is just our introduction to UDL. If you have any questions, make sure that you make note of it, add it to the end of your discussion guide, email it to me, or feel free to ask in class. All right, I'll see you in the next video.